Hello everyone, this is Dr. Hauk. In this lecture here, we're going to complete our discussion of Chapter 5. If you recall, we had reached postmodernism the last day that we met. Okay, well, I'm looking at the first paragraph. Before we talk about postmodernism, look at essentialism. It's like the third or fourth line under the heading postmodernism. Maybe fifth or sixth line, and read with me. Essentialism is the mindset that accepts the cultural conception of nature without criticism. And skip a couple lines there. So in this essentialist world, gender atypicality, transsexualism, same-sex sexual orientation, and even intersex conditions where individuals are born with ambiguous genitalia were all considered freakish, unnatural, and immoral. And then next line, of course, racism, misogyny, and xenophobia were not viewed in a negative light. So basically we're discussing the sort of traditional world, the world of the America of the 1950s and earlier, so to speak. Another way we can describe this, the pre-postmodern world. Well, today we know all these things are changed. Essentialism, the problem with essentialism is that it basically took culture at face value. And as we've seen in this course, culture has made a lot of mistakes in regard to race, gender, sexuality, religions, etc. Now look at the next paragraph. Fast forward to today's world, at least ideally, and this is in a postmodern world, no individual is marginalized as no one privileged group is overtly allowed to speak for everyone at their expense. Remember the definition of postmodernism, the gradual encroachment of the other into what was once considered privileged space. Well, that privileged space has disappeared. You will certainly want to refer back to that chart. It's labeled the 1950s, and the other side of the chart is labeled the 2010s. I think that goes back to the first lecture maybe on postmodernism. Make sure you look at that. The last sentence in that paragraph that I was just reading reads, gender essentialism, like the old school traditional way of looking at things, has been replaced by transgenderism. And so in other words, we're now open to the idea that the two gender scheme is no longer viable. All right, to continue on here, look at the paragraph that begins, there's a lot of truth in Gellner's statement. And look at the last sentence. It reads that it may go too far in doing so, and it does not change the fact that postmodernism forces us to rethink important concepts like truth, authority, power, and standards. Because after all, there has to be a standard recognized group in power that we're trusting before all of these things are viable. Postmodernists are wary and suspicious of all these things. There's a chart on right there below the next paragraph. Modernism on one side, postmodernism on the other. Make sure you read through that, and you get a pretty good idea of the contrast between the two. In regard to religion, look at the paragraph below the chart. Thus, with the movement from modernism to postmodernism, we have a transition from religious fundamentalism to spiritualism or agnosticism. So that's one interesting movement that's happened in religions. In other words, people are less inclined to embrace institutionalized traditional forms of religion and instead are opting for more individualistic religious expressions like spiritualism or even agnosticism. If you drop down about 6 lines in that paragraph, it reads, the postmodernists would note that we have a situation of competing truths. Well, remember the example of the Tsimbaga and their curious homesteading customs way high up in the hills. So when we're talking about competing truths, that's the sort of thing we're thinking about. So think of the Tsimbaga example when you see competing truths. In the next paragraph, I address that. Look at the third line, we should not assume that this is the end of the story. After all, that is our story and not the story of the Simbagans. In fact, the postmodernists are correct. And what I'm referring to there is the fact that there are multiple truths. There's the scientific truth. There is the emic, native, Simbagan truth. And there's even the anthropological truth, which sort of puts all these things together. However, look at the next line. I want to read it and then make a point, an important point. Postmodernism goes too far, however, when it merely throws science back into the mix of competing epistemologies and claims that any one is just as good as any other. I, like many other scholars, agree that while postmodernism has a lot of good things to say, especially in regard to anthropology, its critique of science is not valid. Because after all, science offers us knowledge that is valid universally, regardless of culture, custom, religion, language, geography, whatever. Okay, so I just wanted to make that point. And to sort of further elucidate that point, look at the first sentence in the next in the next paragraph. The fact of the matter is that there is knowledge that transcends culture, and I'm referring to science there. Okay, in section 4, fieldwork and ethnographic methodology, I'm just going to hit a few high points. Of course, you have the reading assigned, so please do it. About halfway through the first sentence there, fieldwork is the first step in anthropological analysis. That's the laboratory for the anthropologist. The anthropologist is not a tourist. Rather, she must thoughtfully and methodically engage herself in the life ways of the people being studied. There's an important paragraph regarding my work in the second paragraph. This writer's work on the Orisha religion in Trinidad uncovered a sophisticated metastructure that was comprised of some components that were acting to expand the religion and some that were acting to contract the religion. Such a structure only became clear after certain details regarding gender, ethnicity, history, and politics were taken into consideration. So in other words, my research of the Orisha religion took me far beyond simply the religious life of my contacts. And that's a classical functionalist study, right? I had to locate religion in the wider context of the society. You see the cover of the book, and the title was Spirits, Blood, and Drums, the Orisha Religion in Trinidad. Next paragraph, it's noted here that really one of the first steps is to secure funding, because if you're doing field work, you have to pay for it. And it's going to be an expensive endeavor because you'll be someplace for a minimum of 1 calendar year. Okay, under ethics, there is a code of ethics, as is noted there. But in my mind, as I have quoted here, there is one statement that sort of encapsulates the spirit of anthropological ethics. Quote, anthropological researchers must do everything in their power to ensure that their research does not harm the safety, dignity, or privacy of the people with whom they work, conduct research, or perform other professional activities. Next paragraph, part of this will involve getting informed consent. This is the same sort of informed consent that those working in healthcare are expected to get before they do anything to a patient. Before you can get informed consent, you must be dealing with an adult of sound mind, and you must be forthright with information. In other words, you must tell them exactly what you're doing, why you're doing, and then finally they must consent. Well, pretty much the same thing happens in anthropology, although some of the mechanics might be slightly different. But yes, you have to be honest about and frank about exactly about what you're doing, and make sure you have consent from the people you're working with before you take photographs, do recordings, do any kind of observation, etc. Second important point, next paragraph, you should never use people's names. In rare cases, they may ask you to use their names. You will see I did use a few names in that chapter excerpt from my book. but those individuals asked me to use their names. Next paragraph mentions the term informants, but that term is no longer really used anymore. And the term I like to use is contacts. It's a nice neutral sort of word for the people I work with. The little digging deeper essay, make sure you read through it. It won't be too difficult to get the gist of what's happening. In a nutshell, you have an anthropologist doing field work somewhere, and because the anthropologist has to have a lot of food stored, they sort of looked at this particular anthropologist as being selfish and being a hoarder of food and so forth, which is totally different from the way the Coon Bushmen carry on. And so the anthropologist, as you read, decided that he would buy a huge ox for the Christmas feast, and then they would see how generous he was. But even after he bought the huge ox, they still made fun of it. They went on as if it was a skinny beast that wouldn't feed a family and so forth and so on. And then finally, Richard Lee, the anthropologist, learned what was going on, and you can read down in one of the last paragraphs. It says, so what was going on? Well, Lee was being taught a lesson in cultural relativity. Look at the quote from one of the elders. When a young man kills much meat and he thinks of himself as a chief or a big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his servants or inferiors, we can't accept this. We refuse one who boasts, for someday his pride will make him kill somebody. So we always speak of his meat as worthless. This way we cool his heart and make him gentle. Next paragraph, in the Coon culture, pride would lead to selfishness and egoism, character traits that could be fatal for hunter-gatherers living in the harsh, arid climes of the Kalahari. So the primary economic system engaged in by the Coon people is sharing and reciprocity. And the idea is that you may never hoard goods and you may never stuff yourself and gorge yourself, but on the other hand, you will also never starve because everyone shares with everyone else. That's the idea of reciprocity. Reciprocity is the idea that I will help you today with the understanding that at some later point you will help me. And that's the sort of ethical system that has to apply for them to survive in such a harsh environment. Okay, under productivity, some important terms. Participant observation. Of course, that's the ideal. Ideally, the anthropologist will be somewhat of a participant and somewhat of an observer. As it says there, the idea is to reduce the social distance between you and the people you're working with. But as you note in the next paragraph, find the term cultural immersion, and that is the philosophy I like to use in my field work, where you totally immerse yourself into the culture of the people you're studying. Now, that might incline you to be overly subjective, but at some point you will be writing your study. You'll be doing your analysis, you'll be crunching your numbers, and that's where the objectivity will come in. I'll talk a little bit about how important sharing food is. Make sure you read through that. Food is often an ethnic identity marker, so that's why it's so important to share food. There's a little discussion of culture shock. Please read through that very carefully. Culture shock will peak after the anthropologist is in the field, probably 3 or 4 months. But then also, there's a rather curious rebound effect where the anthropologist will also experience culture shock once he or she returns home, because they've been in one particular culture for so long. By the time they return home, their home culture is now somewhat unfamiliar to them. The whole thing is based on a disorientation that's caused by the individual being estranged from their native culture. That's the whole idea of culture shock. So please read through that carefully. And the last term you see there is reflexivity. Reflexivity. This is just being aware of your personal biases, being aware of any sort of personal acts you may have to grind, your personal political persuasion. All these things can affect good anthropological writing. So it's important that the field worker be aware of whatever biases and prejudices they may harbor and try to guard from having them affect their writing and their work. So reflexivity, very, very important.